He covered the doorbell camera with a plastic planter lid. Not tape, not spray paint, not a tool brought from home. A planter lid he found sitting outside the house. And that single decision may tell investigators more about this crime than anything else released publicly, because the wireless cameras on Nancy Guthrie's property had already gone dark before he ever stepped onto the porch. Cleanly, technically, almost professionally. Whoever disabled them appeared to understand exactly what system the house used and exactly how to interrupt it. But the hardwired camera was different. That one he discovered in real time, which means the person standing on that porch may not have been the person who truly understood the plan. That is the contradiction sitting at the center of this case. One part of this crime looks organized, another part looks improvised. One part suggests planning, another suggests panic. And somewhere between those two versions is the truth about what happened to Nancy Guthrie. There's a moment in the footage investigators recovered from Nancy Guthrie's porch that feels almost invisible the first time you watch it. Not because nothing happens, but because too much happens at once. The figure approaches the house in darkness, covered head to toe, gloves, mask, backpack, weapon visible. The kind of image that immediately triggers a reaction in people because the intent already feels wrong before a single action takes place. Then something strange happens. He hesitates, not dramatically, just enough. He scans the porch instead of moving directly. He adjusts himself, looks around, reorients, and then, instead of using some sophisticated tool to disable the doorbell camera, he grabs a plastic planter lid and physically covers it. That matters, because investigators believe the wireless cameras were already offline before he reached the front door. Those systems appear to have been disrupted electronically, intentionally, which requires a completely different level of knowledge than what we see on the porch footage. And that creates a possibility investigators may already be considering privately. The man captured on camera may not be the person who designed this crime. He may have been following instructions from someone else. Someone who understood the property better than he did. Someone who knew the routines, the cameras, the timing, possibly even the layout inside the house. That is what this case may ultimately become about. Not just the man on the porch, but the person who never appeared on camera at all. Nancy Guthrie had lived in the Catalina foothills long enough that her life had become part of the rhythm of the neighborhood itself. Neighbors recognized her vehicle. Church friends expected her at regular gatherings. She had routines people unconsciously learned over years without realizing they were learning them. And routines are important in cases like this, because routines are what allow planning. The Catalina foothills north of Tucson is quiet in a way that outsiders often misunderstand. The homes sit back from the road. Desert brush absorbs sound. Streets empty early. At night, darkness settles across the hills so completely that a moving flashlight can stand out from hundreds of feet away. People who live there often believe isolation creates safety. But isolation can also create opportunity. Nancy had spent decades building a life there. Family dinners, church involvement, long-standing friendships, familiar habits, familiar roads. The kind of life that feels stable precisely because it has stayed unchanged for so long. Which is why this case feels so unsettling to people following it. Because nothing about it feels random. According to investigators, Nancy was last seen by family the evening before she disappeared. The following morning, concern started quietly. Not panic. Concern. A friend noticed Nancy had missed something she normally never missed. That detail matters more than people realize, because it means there was likely a gap of many hours between whatever happened inside that home and the moment anyone understood something was wrong. By then, the scene had already cooled. And when investigators entered the house, the evidence they found did not paint a simple picture. Blood near the entrance, signs of disturbance, missing surveillance functionality, a missing woman, but also something else. Things left behind. Her phone, her belongings, critical medication. That combination immediately complicated the narrative, because crimes that begin as planned abductions usually depend on control. Control of movement. Control of communication, control of the victim's condition. And yet several details investigators found inside the house suggested control may have broken down very early. The ransom notes would later push the public toward one conclusion: kidnapping. But the notes did not go privately to the family. They went to TMZ. That is not typical hostage behavior. That is media behavior. And those are not always the same thing. Now, go back to the porch footage. Not to what the suspect is doing, to how he is doing it. He does not move like someone deeply familiar with the environment. He moves like someone trying to match reality to instructions already given to him. That distinction matters. Professionals simplify movement. They reduce hesitation. They conserve time. Their bodies look committed before their actions even begin. This individual does not look committed. He looks careful, almost self-conscious. Former FBI profiler James Clementi publicly discussed aspects of footage and noted behavioral details that stood out immediately. Grooming, presentation, visible attention to appearance. Even under stress, people tend to remain who they already are, and the man on the porch appears highly image-conscious. Trimmed facial hair, coordinated clothing, fitted appearance. Nothing about him suggests chaos in his normal life. In fact, the opposite may be true, which makes the weapon placement even stranger. The firearm appears positioned awkwardly at the front of the body, a location many experienced firearm users would avoid because it slows access and complicates movement under pressure. That contradiction matters, because it creates the same pattern investigators keep encountering throughout this case. Parts of the crime appear sophisticated, parts appear amateur. The camera disruption suggests planning. The porch behavior suggests uncertainty, and uncertainty becomes even more important once investigators believe he entered the house. Because according to publicly discussed reporting surrounding the investigation, Nancy had removed her hearing aids before bed, meaning verbal commands may not have worked immediately. Think about what that means. If the person entering the home expected compliance and instead encountered confusion, delay, or resistance, the entire operation could have changed within seconds. Suddenly, the timeline makes more sense. The blood evidence makes more sense. The apparent disorder makes more sense. A plan that expected quiet cooperation may have collapsed almost immediately once reality replaced rehearsal. And if the plan collapsed inside the house, then the most important person in this entire case may not be the man on camera. It may be the person who gave him the plan in the first place. Investigators eventually widened the surveillance perimeter around the neighborhood, and that is where another important detail reportedly emerged. A neighboring camera, not directly at Nancy's property, captured what investigators believe may have been a related vehicle image. Not a clean identification, not a plate, just enough to matter. But by the time that footage surfaced, valuable time had already passed. That matters because routes in and out of the Catalina foothills are not random. Someone familiar with the area would know where cameras tend to face, which roads stay darker, which exits create fewer opportunities for visibility. That kind of knowledge usually comes from repetition, not Google Maps, not theory, experience. And this is where the case begins pulling in two directions at once. On one side, you have signs of planning, surveillance awareness, timing, route selection, camera disruption. On the other side, hesitation, physical confrontation, blood evidence, public ransom confusion, improvised camera concealment. It almost feels like two different crimes overlapping each other, one intelligent, one unstable. And investigators may already suspect exactly that, because if the porch suspect truly understood the technical systems on the property, why improvise at the final camera? Why spend so much time exposed? Why leave behind evidence? Why allow the situation to spiral into visible violence? Unless the person executing the crime was operating on borrowed confidence handed to him by someone who understood the environment better than he did. That possibility changes everything, because now investigators are no longer looking only for a masked suspect. They are potentially looking for someone connected to Nancy's life already, someone who understood the house before the crime ever began. The most dangerous person in this case may never have touched the porch camera, because the person who understands the victim's routines rarely needs to be physically present to shape what happens next. Now comes the uncomfortable part of this investigation. The kind investigators approach carefully because speculation can destroy innocent people if handled irresponsibly. So this is important. No public evidence has confirmed the identity of any suspect. No charges have been announced. No individual has been publicly named as responsible for Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. But investigators in cases involving older victims, valuable property, and signs of planning almost always examine the same categories first: relationships, access, money, routine, familiarity. Not because family involvement is common, but because familiarity changes what is possible. The rear doors reportedly being open or accessible matters. The timing matters. The apparent awareness of Nancy's schedule matters. And the ransom communications matter too, because ransom operations normally depend on leverage, communication, proof of life, ongoing negotiation. But these notes appeared publicly through media channels after the case was already national news. That creates another contradiction. If the crime was truly about money, why lose control of the narrative immediately? Why introduce publicity before demonstrating leverage? Why create fear before proving custody? One possibility is that the ransom communications were authentic but poorly executed. Another is that someone unrelated inserted themselves into the story after the disappearance became public. And a third possibility exists too, that the original plan failed and the narrative changed afterward. Investigators have likely explored every version, because once a crime begins collapsing under pressure, people improvise, and improvisation leaves evidence. The blood near the front entrance may be the single most important detail in the entire case, because if the intended exit was somewhere else, then something inside that house went wrong. This is why the idea of borrowed confidence matters. The suspect on the porch looked prepared, until the situation stopped matching the instructions. Then the gaps appeared, the hesitation, the improvisation, the exposed timeline, the confrontation. That is what investigators notice in crimes where planning and execution do not match. Someone understood the strategy. Someone else carried it out. And if that theory is correct, then the unanswered questions in this case become much more personal. Who knew the house well enough to discuss the cameras? Who understood Nancy's routines? Who knew when she would likely be alone? Who understood the neighborhood well enough to navigate it comfortably at night? Those questions matter because familiarity leaves invisible fingerprints long before physical evidence appears. The FBI's forensic work remains ongoing. Behavioral analysis remains ongoing. Blood evidence analysis remains ongoing. And investigations like this often change quietly before the public sees movement. A vehicle match, a financial record, a communication trail, a phone location, a witness finally deciding to speak. Those are the moments that eventually crack open complicated cases. And this case feels complicated for a reason, because the truth may not be hiding behind the mask. It may be hiding behind whoever helped place the mask there in the first place. Nancy Guthrie disappeared from the home where she had spent years building a life. That fact remains unchanged beneath every theory, every headline, every behavioral profile, and every online discussion. An older woman vanished. Blood was left behind. And someone walked onto that property believing they understood exactly how the night would unfold. But something changed. Something disrupted the plan. And investigators appear to believe the answer to what change may ultimately identify everyone involved. The man on the porch may eventually be identified through footage, forensic evidence, or witness recognition. But the larger question, the one sitting behind the entire investigation, is whether he arrived at that house carrying instructions that originated much closer to Nancy Guthrie's life than anyone initially wanted to believe. That possibility is why this case continues gripping people across the country, because random violence is frightening, but familiar violence is harder to process. The FBI continues asking for information connected to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. The investigation remains active, and one detail still refuses to go away. The wireless cameras were disabled before the suspect reached the porch, but the doorbell camera had to be handled manually. One part of this crime looked planned, the other looked improvised. And somewhere between those two versions is the person investigators may still be trying to find.